Now that question really goes to kind of the heart of the Canadian dilemma in terms of the most important relationship being the Canada-US relationship, our dependence, our economic interdependence with the United States, and international crises. Where does the US stand on these? And this also, of course, brings into play if there's a conflict between a US position, as there has been more and more, and international law. So I would say that going along to get along is, maybe a short-term answer, but it doesn't do anything to address the bigger problem of what happens when Canada's in the crosshairs, and that we really should be not going out of our way to antagonize the United States, but we should be working as hard as we can to promote dialogue and to promote a diplomatic solution. So where that's possible, that's what we should be trying to do. Often it's behind the scenes, and so there doesn't necessarily have to be a direct conflict with the United States. That kind of behind the scenes approach is one that Canada used to engage in the past, in sort of the golden days of diplomacy. There's a problem with that now, in that with social media, with diplomats from around the world, leaders tweeting, there's an expectation that your government's going to be doing something, saying something about every important crisis on the world stage. And so there's an education process that's actually needed in public terms. For example, Norway has really staked out territory as an international mediator, a facilitator. They're doing it now with respect to Venezuela. But they have to do that behind the scenes. And they did this with Guatemala, for example, a long negotiation over several years. And there has to be an understanding in the public that the government is not going to grandstand, is not going to, say, look at what we're doing here. There has to be a bit of a maturity with respect to the public's understanding of what Canada's doing. And that is very challenging in current circumstances, because there's always a tendency to play to domestic audiences on international issues. The previous government did that, was particularly active in that regard. And that again means that there are particular constituencies in Canada, the ones that say, left a country, say the Iranians that left Iran when the Shah was overthrown. They have a very particular perspective, and they may be demanding that Canada act in a certain way. So the quiet diplomacy can pay huge dividends, including with respect to the United States, where we can be where in the past we have been quite useful behind the scenes. But it does run into this problem where the government has to be demonstrating it's doing something, which means in addition to the quiet diplomacy, they have to have some areas of quite active public diplomacy that can be seen. The feminist foreign policy is an obvious example of that, but they have to be careful that the stuff that they're doing in public, the initiatives they have in public, aren't just seen as window dressing, that there really are important measures that are being taken. There's substance behind the hoopla.
I don't think anybody, or very few people, think Canada should go along to get along. I think that has a very negative connotation. There is a little bit of quiet diplomacy that is necessary to be an effective player on the global stage, and I think Canada, when it's at its most effective, does practice that, while maintaining a strong focus on our interests and taking a strong stand when it is necessary, including in public platforms, but to ensuring that we have a nice balance between quieter diplomacy that is conducted to build solutions to pressing international problems, while also standing up for our fundamental goals, interests on the world stage.
Should Canada go along to get along? We had a prime minister some years ago who liked to argue that Canada never should go along to get along. My own view is that that's too absolutist a position, that there are some times where it actually makes sense to go along to get along. Sometimes it makes sense to stand up for what you believe. But you can't have, it seems to me, a kind of a formulaic approach to that. You have to make the choice with the particular issue at hand. And in particular, you've got to think about what your interests are. And sometimes your interests say you've got to go along to get along. And sometimes your interests say you've got to stand up for yourself on this particular issue.
I think one of the problems that Canadians as a whole suffer from is the notion that we want to be liked globally. We want to be seen to be, quote, making a difference. That we continue to believe that the world wants more Canada. And the truth is that the world isn't waiting for more Canada. The world isn't waiting for us to decide what it is we have to contribute to some of the major problems. I think at the end of the day, the real challenge for policymakers is to advance Canadian interests in the world. And that means promoting a stable security order by investing in defense and our traditional alliance commitments. We have not been doing that to the degree we should. Secondly, diversifying our trade relationships so that we're not as dependent on the United States as we are, because the high degree of that dependency essentially allows the United States to call the shots when we negotiate with them. And we're forced to playing defense as opposed to playing an offensive game, which is what you need to be doing.